Okay, welcome, people. We're continuing. Today, we're, of course, going to be talking about how freedom was fought for and how freedoms were denied. As we mentioned before, Black people contributed to the American Revolution. They, of course, believed that it meant something for them. We're going to see, as should be no surprise, that it's not going to mean as much for them as they had hoped. Um, this, of course, this section, the revolution and the freedoms and all that kind of, this is a very long section. So, appreciate you staying with me. The problem also is compounded by the fact that this is we have to squeeze in a lot of information into a very small amount of time. So, bear with me. Okay, let's just get into this. So, the revolution. As the war ends, it's clear that the British, they're not committed to freeing slaves. Even those slaves that had run off to them, they're not really really caring about them. In fact, as they retreat from Yorktown, they leave behind a bunch of slaves. They just leave them to fend for themselves. There are just too many of them to transport out. A lot of these people, many, perhaps most of them, are captured, especially in the southern areas. Now, there are some of them who actually make it aboard the departing ships, as we know, and 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 some of these are actually registered to go. Right, there's only so much room. They've registered some to go, and they take them with them. But others actually are going to be sold into slavery. There are just too many of these people to take care of. So they take those who make it aboard the ships. Some of them they will send off to places like Canada. And some of them, the extras, so to speak, to put it quite badly, they're going to be sold into slavery. Also, when the British leave, they return runaway slaves to those people who remain loyal to the crown. And they're going to help these loyalists leave. And they're going to transport them and their slaves out. And they're still going to be slaves because they remain loyal to the crown. The crown isn't going to bother with that property relationship. In fact, also, after they leave, they're going to actually, the British, return many slaves who should have been freed by the British proclamation, by those two proclamations that we talked about. A lot of slaves had run off to them in good faith, but as part of the peace negotiations with the United States, England is going to give them back, a lot of them. George Washington gets his slaves back. So George Washington gets them back, and he will. People say, "Well, George Washington freed his slaves." Well, yeah, but he only did it after his death. So there, from the point of view of the British, it's clear they had sought to use slaves only to their own advantage. Right? They leave a bunch of them behind. They take what they can carry. Who they can carry, I should say. Some of them are freed. They go off to Canada. Some of them, as I said, are going to be sold into slavery. They return some to their owners, both, depending on, it didn't matter which side they were on. If you were loyal to the crown, we return them to you. And a lot of as part of the peace negotiations, a lot of the people among what you would call patriots got their slaves back. So it's clear that the British didn't really care so much. Most slaves, in fact, we had seen this already. I didn't really talk about this, but most slaves who had run away to them during the war didn't even fight, right? They were used as menial and supportive work. A few fought, but most slaves that ran off to the British were used to find supplies, to carry supplies, to cook and clean, and a lot of them were, in fact, used to do the dirty work. They're the ones digging the grave. They're the ones carrying the dead. And they're the ones living harsh, harsh lives. These slaves who lived amongst the British during the war are actually, they're not fed very well. They're going to be constantly hungry, constantly thirsty, dying in huge numbers from disease. Thousands of these people will die of diseases that run through the military camps. And they're not going to be the first in terms of triage, right? They're not going to be the first ones on the doctor's list to be seen. No, they're at the bottom. But a lot of slaves, as I said, and I should emphasize this, do take advantage of the situation. We're going to see about 15,000 of them be transported out to other British areas. They're going to live as free men and women. Most of them go to Canada, Nova Scotia, right? most of them go to Canada. Many others, in fact, won't even bother with any of this. They won't leave it up to the British. They're going to, a lot of them, escape into the interior and set up maroon communities. And a lot of these will, in fact, still believe they are fighting for the British, not because they're loyal to the crown necessarily, but because they still believe that the British are their best hope for freedom. So all of these men who had taken sides, right, and sided with the British and fought and helped and died, a lot of these people, of course, are not going to be given the credit they deserve. But some of them, as I said, after the British leave, will set up these maroon communities. In fact, as an example, they're called the King of England's Soldiers in Georgia. In Georgia, there's a group, about 100 or so men, who come together believing they're fighting for the king. So they call themselves the King of England's Soldiers. And they set up this maroon community and they exact guerrilla raids against white towns. And this lasts for a few years in Georgia. Now, in 1787, a couple of years after the war is over, they're finally going to be scattered by the Georgia militia. They're going to be scattered. A lot of these guys are going to run off to other places. Some of them go to South Carolina, other maroon communities, but they're scattered. And in fact, their leader is going to be executed. They're going to put his head on a pike. So this shows a few things, right? It shows that slaves that remained really, I mean, it shows agency, right? They're like, we're not going to leave it up to the British. We're going to go our own way. We're going to set up maroon communities. And we have an example, the King of England Soldiers. Other bands of Maroons throughout the coast, Georgia, South Carolina, do the same thing. And they can, and actually this is more popular in, more likely to happen around South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. These are the areas with a lot of swamplands and marshlands and a lot of areas in the interior where a lot of white settlers don't want to go because the climate and the terrain is forbidding. So you will see other bands of Maroons set up along that. And in fact, these Maroon communities, small as they are and as temporary as they are, will end up fighting all the way through the end of the Civil War until slavery is over. This is not something that we normally hear of. So from the British point of view, it's like, thank you very much. From the slaves' point of view, they did what they could, and they're still doing what they can. Those who ran off. Now, in the United States, we have, of course, the formation of a new nation. As the war ends, many people in the new emerging nation are beginning to believe that slavery might soon end. Some people are hopeful of it. Others, of course, lament that. They regret that idea. But a lot of people, and this is, of course, is going to be particularly in the North, are going to embrace revolutionary ideas and Enlightenment thinking and apply them to this idea of slavery. And these ideas are embraced by a lot of people, even poor people at the bottom. Those at the bottom, even poor white men, women, free and black, slaves, a lot of these people are seeing that there's a hypocrisy here in the formation of a new nation based on these lofty principles of freedom. At the same time, they're holding slaves. So this revolution has led a lot of people to believe that slavery would eventually end, and it will end soon enough. A lot of people think it's not sustainable. Politically, it's not sustainable. They call it a paradox. They call it the paradox of slavery. A paradox, of course, is where two opposing sorts of entities or forces or themes are in they're in contradiction to each other, but they exist connected to each other. So you can look up that word yourself if you don't know what it means, but it's a paradox, right? It doesn't fit. There's a paradox of slavery in this new nation because here we have hundreds of thousands of people enslaved within a nation that is saying it's based on liberty and equality. And so people key into this and they say, this doesn't make sense. The revolution has infused the nation with ideas of freedom, and people are calling out this hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of this nation is on full display. Alexander Hamilton, for example, he's one of many, especially in the North, who frees his slaves. He frees his slaves and he joins the New York Manumission Society. It is, as you can probably tell, a society that is geared, that is dedicated to the freeing of slaves. So people say this is a paradox. Slavery cannot exist in this country if it is going to be built on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. But it also is not a nation that will be secure in itself as it grows, as it matures, as it expands. No nation will be secure so long as slaves exist. Because slave resistance is going to happen, especially revolts. And so a lot of people in the new nation are thinking, you know what? The writing is on the wall. Slavery is going to come to an end. A lot of people think it's really going to come to an end also for economic reasons, not just these political reasons that we talked about, it's notions of hypocrisy. There's an economic reason, and that is that during the war, a lot of farmers have switched over their crops. They have moved over from things like tobacco. And what they're doing is growing things like wheat and other grains. This happens in the North and in the Chesapeake. So the North, we're talking about New England, middle colonies, right? And the Chesapeake, we're talking about the upper South, right? We're still talking about Maryland and Virginia. In these areas, these farmers decided they were going to switch crops because they have to feed armies. They decided it's more lucrative and more important to feed their armies. So they switched to wheat and other grains and away from tobacco. Now, these crops are going to stick around. They're not going to switch back. The country is growing, and for economic reasons, they decide they're going to stick with it. And the importance of switching to wheat and other grains during the revolution is that these crops need less labor. They're not like tobacco, which need constant attention, constant labor. So what happens is that the war, because of the switching from tobacco to wheat and other grains, the war has actually made it possible to free thousands of slaves. So you will see in the North and in the upper South, meaning the Chesapeake, you're going to see a lot of slaves freed on moral grounds, like we talked about, Enlightenment thinking and so forth, conscience, but also on economic grounds. There's a surplus of labor. Now, not all slave owners are going to free their slaves for economic reasons or for any reason. A lot of them will say, yeah, it's wrong, or yeah, I don't really need 5 slaves anymore when I can only use 3. I'm going to sell those extra 2 down the river. So a lot of slaves also during this period of time get shifted around. So if you are a slave owner, for example, in the Chesapeake, who has switched to grains, wheat, you don't need as many slaves as you used to because you're no longer growing tobacco and you're still making money. Well, you don't need these slaves. Instead of freeing them, you might just sell them. So a lot of slaves are getting shifted around at this time. Point being that there's a lot of change going on. And in the North especially, a lot of change with regard to ideas of slavery and ideas of who or where Black people belong within the nation. Because in the North, there's a growing population of free Black people. And a lot of people are gaining their freedom based on their service in the war, their contribution to the war. So in the North, people are looking at this as a change. Now, let's not take this too far. We're going to actually look at how, this is going to have its limits. But there's a growing sentiment that, free Black people deserve some place in the country, rather than, of course, being slaves. This happens in the North, and in the North especially, they're going to be guided by religious sentiment and turning against slavery. They will say slavery is ungodly. They say WWJD, right? What would Jesus do? And of course, these are the evangelicals and the Quakers and so forth. So in the North, there's a growing sense that slavery is on its way out. In fact, we know that states are outlawing slavery. We see that there are laws in Vermont, right? In Vermont actually issues some form of emancipation in its constitution in 1777. We of course have seen, Massachusetts court cases, Pennsylvania statutes, and others following suit. But again, all of this has its limits. Slave owners, even in the North, they're pushing back, right? They don't like this idea that even gradual emancipation is a problem. Slave owners say, look, I contributed my slaves instead of, I contributed my property. I want my property back. Of course, there's a lot of people push back against that. Some people get freed, some don't. But the slave owners, a lot of them are pushing back, and a lot of them are opposing laws that are outlawing slavery, even if gradually. And I've said this before, but the laws ending slavery, they're gradual. They're not radical. These are not radical laws. We're talking about gradual emancipation, even in the North. For example, Pennsylvania, when it passes its statute, which is by the way, a statute is a legislative law, right? It's a law made by the governing legislature. Pennsylvania passes a law to free slaves, but it's limited. It says, newborn slaves will be slaves until they turn age 21. So that's not ending slavery. That's ending slavery slowly. And in fact, if you are born a slave in Pennsylvania, before you turn age 21, it's possible you might be sold down the river. So it's going to be slow going, even in the North, with regard to the breakdown, the abolition of slavery. Even Vermont has been properly lauded, right, praised for outlawing slavery, quote unquote. But if you look closely, you will see that the abolition does not apply to children. It applies to males over 21 years old and females over 18. Now, Vermont did this before Pennsylvania, which is why it's important. But it's not much different from the Pennsylvania statute. Vermont says, males over 21 and females over 18 will be freed. So it applies only to adults. The idea, of course, is that it should be gradual, because you cannot, or they found it difficult, let me put it that way, to pass a law that would immediately strip the property of slave owners. They knew that they had to do it slowly, and a slave owner would have the possibility, the time, to sell off the children before they reach that particular age. And we have to understand, many, or perhaps most whites don't strongly oppose slavery. There's a lot of people in the North who are afraid of the end of slavery. Think about it. What would Black freedom look like in the country? If you end slavery in the North, which states are starting to do, albeit slowly, what does it mean? Competition for jobs, right? Because these slaves are going to want jobs, and they're probably going to work cheaper than a white man because they're not used to getting any money at all. So a lot of white people are like, no, I don't like this because it's going to create a larger labor surplus. It's going to devalue my job, devalue my pay. Also, what else is next? This guy's free. That means what? Race mixing is next? Guy's going to be sleeping with my sister? Because now we're talking about everybody getting along and maybe even, God forbid, racial equality. That's how they see it. So a lot of people, even in the North, are resistant to all these changes that they see coming. But we see some movement in the North against it. And it is, of course, in the North where we will see finally, right around the 1830s, abolitionism, the fight to end slavery, take off. But it's slow going. In the Upper South, again, the Chesapeake, we know that plantations still exist, and there's still going to be lots of slaves there, and there are going to be no state laws outlawing slavery. The state laws outlawing slavery are the northern states. In the lower South, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, these, of course, are places where plantation agriculture is extremely strong. And slave owners are going to cling very tightly to slavery. You have to remember, many of these people had joined because they wanted to keep their slaves. Many of them in the South had joined the fight against the British because they feared what the British would do if they won, right? They saw the Somerset case. They thought, oh, they're going to end slavery everywhere. They looked at the Dunmore and Clinton proclamations. Clinton, of course, also known as the Phillipsburg Proclamation. So they look at this. They also look at the Declaration of Independence. And they're like, oh, all men are created equal. How far are we going to take this? In fact, with regard to the Declaration of Independence, here's a little interesting factoid for you. And that is that when Thomas Jefferson first writes the Declaration of Independence, well, here, let me just back up. If you ever have read the Declaration of Independence, you will maybe notice that it's a series of grievances, just a long list of complaint, because King did this, because the Parliament did that, because the nation, because the Crown did that, because England did. They blame him for all kinds of things. Thomas Jefferson even blamed slavery on Britain. He basically said, England, it's your fault we have slaves. But guess what? That was taken out of the draft by the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress, Thomas Jefferson didn't write this on his own. He had, of course, others helping him. He had Adams, for example, helping him. And so when they send it to Congress, they actually cut some stuff out. And they say, no, Tom, you can't say this. You can't say that slavery is the fault of the British. Why not? Well, if we blame England for slavery, and if we win, does that mean we have to get rid of slavery? And in fact, a lot of the men in the Continental Congress realized that if they left that in, a lot of southern states, colonies at the time, would not join. So there is something to this contention. So you might have heard of the 1619 Project, and I think I mentioned it before. The 1619 Project is a particular view of history taken by the New York Times that it sets forth that 1619 is in fact the beginning of the U.S. as a nation, because that's when the first slaves were brought in. Now, it can be problematic because we're not even sure those people were slaves. At least they were slaves when they were brought in, but they weren't necessarily slaves when they lived here. We talked, I think, we talked thoroughly about that, I think. My point is simply that according to the 1619 Project, the United States fought the war against England in order to keep its slaves. I believe that to be an overstatement, but there is truth in that regard when it comes to the lower South. It was one of those many things that they had to consider because of Somerset, because of Dunmore and Clinton proclamations, because of the Declaration of Independence. My point being largely this: the lower South, of course, after the Revolution is still going to maintain slavery, and it's going to get stronger, as we'll see. But then we, of course, have the Northwest. Remember that England had already gained all that territory to the Mississippi River. They had gained this during the French and Indian War. Well, now that England is gone, they lost the Revolution. Part of the treaty, part of what's in the treaty is that they pick up all this land. So that means that the new nation is no longer just those 13 states. It actually possesses all this territory out west, and these are just territories. Now, all of these states that existed had already claimed all this territory out west for themselves, but eventually that territory will be ceded, meaning given over to the Continental Congress, to the new nation, to create new states. We're not going to go deeply into that. All I want you to know here is that these are territories, right? And that these territories will be disposed of by the federal government, such as it exists. And so people look to the West and they wonder, okay, we see differences between North and South already with regard to this issue of slavery. Right? We see Pennsylvania outlawing it, Vermont outlawing it, other northern states moving to outlaw it. Meanwhile, the South, the deep South, is becoming, it's still hanging on tightly. So when they look to the West, they decide that they're going to actually handle the Northwest first. And the Northwest, they would call it the Old Northwest, and it was the Northwest at the time because over that line, of course, over the Mississippi River, there was the Kingdom of Spain controlling it. So they look at the Northwest, and these are the states that are today like Michigan, right? Michigan looks like the mitten, right? Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and I'm pretty sure Minnesota. Yeah. So you can look at a map, right? But the point is this area up here is what they decide to dispose of first. And the Continental Congress are wondering, okay, how do we settle these areas? And more importantly, when we look to the West and we carve out new states, are these states going to be slave or free? Well, what they do is form a compromise. And this compromise comes with the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance is set out in 1787. And the Northwest Ordinance does a bunch of things. It sets out rules for including new states. We won't go into that. For our purposes, much more importantly, is that it actually draws a line between North and South. As the nation is looking westward, the Congress is deciding that there will be no slavery in any of the northern states out west. And out west, slavery in the South is accepted. Let me be a little bit more specific. If you look at this map, you will see the Ohio River there. The Ohio River, of course, just below Ohio and by Virginia, and it runs over that area that Virginia had claimed but given up. Today it runs over Kentucky, right? The point is that river is going to be the southern boundary. Above that river, no slavery can exist in any new states created from that territory. No new states. Below that river, yeah, it's fine in a sense. They're not, so the compromise is that as the nation is looking westward, they're really kind of cutting the nation in half with regard to the issue of slavery. So think about that. They're cutting the country in half. And so what are we seeing here already? I mean, it's been a while that we should have seen this coming, but we've already seen the beginning of the Civil War. We are well on our way to civil war, since settlement, really. Since the beginning of settlement period, remember, the North and the South were largely populated for different reasons by different sorts of people with different ideas about what a nation would look like, with different interests. And we've seen this going on for a while, but we're seeing it extended out west. And by the way, it is going to be this extension out west, our territorial expansion out west, and the issue of slavery that is going to lead us to civil war. But it starts way back when, right? Slavery in the South accepted, no slavery north of that Ohio River line. And something else happens in 1787. In 1787, we know that a bunch of men, some 50 men or so, meet in Philadelphia to craft a new constitution. The nation had, in the meantime, been operating under the Articles of Confederation. I didn't go deeply into that, but the Articles of Confederation were basically, it turned out to be a prototype for our Constitution. Okay. Let's not worry about that too much. The point is, in 1787, they come together to form a constitution at the Constitutional Convention. This constitution is going to be a product of all these conflicts that we talked about. The product of the differences between North and South, and other differences as well, to be sure. For example, there was a variety of conflicts, not just the issue of slavery, right? There's a variety of conflicts. When the men come together in Philadelphia in this hot, hot summer and they close everything down in Philadelphia and they don't let people in and they're sworn to secrecy and all that, they go there and they battle it out. And they argue over how big the new government should be, because people say, oh, we should have a strong central government, and others say, no, states should be more important. Others argue, or they all argue, about how will representation look in Congress. Is Congress going to represent the people, or is it going to represent the state? Of course, what they come down to in this, with regard to this question, is that both will be represented. I'm kind of giving you guys a quick and dirty. This is more of a government thing in terms of, and I don't think, I don't know which states still teach civics, but here in Texas, we don't teach civics anymore. I grew up in Ohio, and they were still teaching civics, and I wonder whether they still do. I don't know. But the point is, so the Constitutional Convention, right, it has a lot of conflict built into it. And as I said, one of those major conflicts is how representation will look in Congress, states or people. And what they come down to is, of course, that both will be represented. This is called the Great Compromise, right? You might remember that, whatever. I don't care about that necessarily. But we should understand how this works, because it's going to be important in a moment. Senators. So first of all, Congress is going to be broken down into two, right? You're going to have senators and you're going to have House members. Senators each state will have two. So as long as you have a state, you have two senators. The House of Representatives will be based on population. The more people you have, the more House members you have to vote for your state. Okay. All of this, and that's, like I said, a quick and dirty, but keep that representation thing in the back of your mind. We're going to talk about it more. All of this is part of the conflict that arises at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. But it is slavery that is the most contentious. It is slavery that divides people more. And this is going to be a North-South division. Remember, the Southerners are determined to hold on to slavery. They're going to want the Constitution to recognize slavery, to protect it. And they won't join in any constitutional convention or any union, they won't join in any, in ratifying, that is signing off on any constitution that does not protect slavery. So when they go to the Constitutional Convention, they're determined to hold on to slavery. And what they want is a few things. They say, okay, based on representation in Congress, especially the House, because the House is based on the number of people within a state. Based on that, I want, for my state, each slave to be counted as a person for purposes of representation in the House. That means that, I might come from Georgia, where more than half the people are enslaved. But those people will be counted in population so that I have more House members. Now, of course, this is perverse, because these House members are supposed to, in fact, represent people. They're not going to represent slave interests. The idea of this is that each person should be represented somehow. And they think, well, because of this, we see an opportunity, because of the way representation is set out, we see an opportunity here. We want each slave counted as a person. The North is like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. You never wanted them counted before. It's only when it's convenient for you. You've always said they were property. In fact, one Northerner gets up and he says something like this, and it's horrible, but I mean, look, listen to his point. He says, you're counting slaves. You've always counted them property. Should I count my horses too? For purposes of representation, count my horse, and therefore, the more horses we all have down up here, the more House members we will have. Of course, he was being facetious, right? He was being a little ridiculous, but he was making a point. Southern states also want any northern state to send back any slaves that run away to them. So, and they want this in the Constitution. They want it put in there so that if any of their slaves runs away, for example, to Vermont or to Pennsylvania, any free state, that state will send them back. The North says, well, wait a minute. States have their own laws. They're outlawing slavery, so why would they send them back? Another thing that the Southern delegates want is that they want to keep the federal government from ever outlawing the international slave trade. They want to keep that pipeline going, that pipeline of slaves over the Middle Passage going. And the North is like, no, I mean, we see that slavery may come to an end, and we're not, and we're okay with shutting off that pipeline, because that's the, there's a lot of people at this constitutional convention from the North who don't really like slavery. They do make their peace with it in a sense, and you can judge them for that, and I get that. But they are thinking maybe it's going to end. And it's not going to end, or it's going to be much more difficult for it to end if that pipeline continues. But the Southern states, they dig in their heels and they're like, no, we're not going to join unless you protect slavery. Meanwhile, the Northerners are assuming that slavery will die anyway. States are outlawing it. There's a spirit of independence. Growers are switching to crops, needing less labor, and so they think, you know what, fine. And what do? They craft a compromise over the issue of slavery. Now, the term slave, slaveholder, slaveholding, that word does not appear anywhere in the U.S. Constitution. Go read it. It doesn't appear. But slavery is deeply embedded within it. The concept, the reality of it is embedded deeply. They don't use the word slave. They use euphemisms, right? Like unfree person. It's a nicer way of saying something harsh, a euphemism. And so why did they do this? Well, perhaps they knew how heinous it was. And the North, of course, which seemed to be on its way to outlawing slavery, will give in. And some will say that the North basically sold slaves down the river, metaphorically. But this compromise that they come up with is going to reject. Let me just pop all these down. It's going to reflect, in fact, regional interests. Remember, by now, the North and the South, they're different. Northerners are more involved in trade, commerce of all kinds of things, and manufacturing is kind of starting to take off. And so, and inventions are starting to take off. In fact, most things in the North are invented, or excuse me, most things in the country are by far, 90% are being invented in the North. Now, a lot of these are ideas that we stole from England, but as opposed to the South isn't doing anything when compared to the North, right? So the Northerners have their own interests, and the Southerners have their own interests. The Northerners are interested in commerce, and so they get the Commerce Clause put into the Constitution. And basically, all that says is this, that the United States Congress, part of the federal government, Congress has the power to regulate trade, commerce, okay, between states and internationally. They also get the copyright clause, and you're probably familiar with that, and that is that anyone who, it has to do with the arts as well, but whatever, anyone who invents something, right, can of course get the credit for it, and nobody can copy it. And they do this because, again, most things are being invented in the North, by far, most things. And so the Northerners get these clauses for them. The Southerners have their own victories. Southerners don't get, of course, to count each slave as a person for purposes of representation in the House, but they get the 3/5 compromise. Now, a lot of people misunderstand the 3/5 compromise. First of all, it applies to slaves. It does not apply to free black people. It applies to slaves. That's one thing. The other thing is that it does not really mean, and they didn't see it this way, that every slave is worth 3/5 of a person. What it really means is that for purposes of representation, you take 5 slaves and 3 of them are counted as people. Now, I don't know which is worse, right? To say that one person is 3/5 of a person, or to say that only 3 out of 5 people are actually people. I don't know which is worse, but in fact, and it's very interesting because if you read the Constitution, it's really difficult to kind of discern what they mean, but this is what they mean: 3 out of 5 slaves. And this is going to mean that they're going to have representation in the House higher than they would otherwise if they only counted white folk or free folk. Let me put it that way. Because this applies with regard to slaves only. They also get the Fugitive Slave Clause. Here's where you get put into the Constitution the mandate, meaning the command, I suppose, where a free state of the North must return any runaway slave. So that's a Southern victory. And then they get the Slave Trade Clause. The Slave Trade Clause basically says that Congress cannot outlaw the international slave trade until 1808. That's not to say that Congress will, or that it should, or that it should, whatever. All they're saying here in this clause is that it cannot do it until 1808 if it ever decides to do it. And we're talking about the international slave trade. Now, I put this in red along with the Commerce Clause because these are kind of tied together. The Commerce Clause, it gives Congress the power to regulate trade between states and between the United States and other countries, right? International. So you would think that they would be able then, the Congress, to outlaw the international slave trade. But this Slave Trade Clause comes in and says, no, you can't do it until 1808. And it goes on to say this clause cannot be amended ever, which I believe is the only place in the Constitution that ever says that. That's the only place that it says this is the rule and you can never amend this, which is, locks it in, which is really quite unusual. Singular, I would say. If you ever read the Constitution, you will see the U.S. Constitution has all these things in it right now. The 3/5 compromise is there, the Fugitive Slave Clause is there, the Slave Trade Clause is there. All that's still there. We didn't scratch it out. We didn't take an eraser, but we have, of course, amended it. But that doesn't come until after the Civil War. Amendments will supersede, meaning overcome these Southern victories. It's interesting. Vermont is trying to actually amend its constitution to take out any reference to slavery. And they're not just going to add an amendment. They're looking to actually take it out of the body of the Constitution because they don't want any reference to slavery in its own state constitution. They've already, of course, outlawed slavery, and they make mention of it in their Constitution. And in fact, as I said before, it's not a very clean emancipation because it only applied to adults. Vermont, it seems, looks at that as a black eye on its history and wants to take it out. Not everybody agrees with that. I'm not so sure, I would need to know more about it, but I have my thoughts on it. And I'm sure, well, I think maybe you do too, as to whether it should be removed. On the one hand, people say, well, we should remove it because it's, it's an abomination. It is a black eye on our state. Others say, well, no, I mean, there's no reason to remove it because that's part of the Constitution as it existed at the time. We know better now, and we have amendments to the Constitution that have outlawed slavery, as well as amendments in the U.S. Constitution that have outlawed slavery. Anyway, kind of digressed there. But here's the thing. This compromise, where the Constitution is established based on the interests, the regional interests, becomes known as the dirty compromise. It feels dirty, right? Both sides are going to benefit. It's going to promote commerce and industry in the North. It will expand the power of the South because they have more House members. They can help elect pro-slavery presidents and eventually control the Supreme Court. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is really beneficial to the South. They have more House members, which means, again, they can help elect because well, I'm going to get too deeply into this. The Electoral College is based on the number of representatives and the number of senators that each state has. Right? Let's not worry too much about that. But here's what I want you to understand is that the Three-Fifths Compromise helps the Southerners elect pro-slavery presidents and eventually control the Supreme Court. It also promotes states' rights of the South. The Fugitive Slave Clause promotes the states' rights of the South while infringing on states' rights of the North. Remember, northern states are outlawing slavery, but the Fugitive Slave Clause actually will allow southern states to reach into free states to get slaves back. So that can be a problem, or that it will be a problem. And then this other thing with the 1808 clause. Yeah, Congress can't outlaw it until 1808, the international slave trade. But who knows if it will? But even if it does, I'm a Southern slaveholder. I've got 20 years to stock up on slaves. I can buy them from the North because they're being sold North because not everybody's freeing them. As gradual emancipation happens in the North, they're selling them. I can buy them from the North. I can still buy them on the Atlantic. This dirty compromise will cement slavery into our form of government. The new nation will be built on the backs of slaves. So slavery is just one of several non-democratic features. People say we got a democracy at the Constitutional Convention, but we didn't, right? Democracy is broader than that. Think about the place of women. Think about, the fact that, there are slaves. Think about the fact that poor white men without property can't vote. So the revolution is only partially fulfilled for a bunch of people. People of all sorts had hoped for more. Slaves had hoped for freedom. They had resisted slavery. They had run away to the British. They had fought. But in the years immediately after the revolution, it's becoming clear that slavery will remain. It will grow stronger as it spreads westward, even as Black men and women continue to fight for greater inclusion. And then something else happens. The South is going to be really happy because plantation agriculture will grow stronger. We're going to see them switching from rice, for example, and some sugar to cotton. Why? Well, as you probably know, I forgot to pop this up. Basically, what happens, I think that one should have been there first. Here's the thing. In 1793, a guy named Eli Whitney, right? He's a northerner, by the way, but he's going to revolutionize southern agriculture. He invents the cotton gin. And that means it's going to be easier to clean cotton. Now, cotton is often associated with slavery, but it's not really up until around 1800 that cotton becomes king. For centuries before cotton comes around, it is rice and indigo and tobacco and even sugar that are the major staples, the cash crops. But Eli Whitney will change all that. Cotton, before the cotton gin, was grown, but it was very difficult to grow a lot of it because it was very difficult to clean. If you've ever looked at raw cotton, that fluffy stuff is actually embedded with all kinds of seeds in it. And if you've ever taken it apart or like try to clean the seeds out, because you can't have the seeds in there, if you've ever tried to take out those seeds, you will see that by the end of the day, your fingertips will be sore and perhaps even bloody because it's so hard to do it by hand. You needed a lot of slaves to do that, but it wasn't worth it because you can only get so much cotton out of it. A slave may be able to clean 2 pounds per day by hand. It's very difficult to do it by hand. My mom, who, she was born in Mexico, she's like 80 something now. She used to work in the cotton fields of Texas and northern Mexico way before my time. I'm talking the 1950s or so. And she used to clean cotton. She used to pick cotton, and she'd say, it was one of the most difficult things to do. Of course, they had machinery by then, and so they didn't have to do all the cleaning of the cotton, but she would be asked to clean certain amounts of cotton. The point is that the cotton gin will revolutionize cotton. A cotton gin will allow one slave to, instead of just cleaning 2 pounds of cotton per day, to actually have cleaned 50 pounds per day. And so cotton, because it is going to be used in textiles, right, clothing and cloth and all kinds of stuff, it is in high demand, but it was very difficult to deal with. But now you have the cotton gin. And so the only thing you need, now you have the cotton gin, the only thing you need to get rich off of the cotton, you need 2 things. You need land, because the more land you have, the more cotton you can grow. And you need slaves, because the more slaves you have, the more money you can make off that land. And cotton, by the way, requires constant labor. There's no task system here. That's going to fall out. No more rice stuff. So cotton, in fact, by 1800, is going to become king. Northern industry and commerce are tied to cotton, right? Because what's going to happen is that cotton will be grown in the South, transported north for production, for manufacturing purposes. It will actually feed the clothing and textile mills of the North. So the North is buying Southern cotton. The world is buying Southern cotton by 1800. And the North is also making money because it's selling slaves south. And when I say the North, I mean private owners. As northern states are outlawing slavery, and as demand for cotton and slaves rises because of the cotton gin, they're just going to be selling more and more of them south. Slave sales are skyrocketing, with slaves coming southward from the north and the importation of thousands. In fact, as I said, because of the cotton gin, because of this boom, and because in 20 years' time, 1808, Congress may actually outlaw the international slave trade, If I'm a slave owner in the South, I want to buy as many slaves as I can and as much land as I can right now. And of course, to do that, you have to move westward. Slavery is moving westward as well as southward. And when we say west, we of course are saying toward the Mississippi River. We know that as this Western territory is opening up, new territories are drawing countless settlers, and cotton is coming with them. The slave territories below the Ohio River, right? The deep South, of course, Mississippi area, Alabama, Louisiana, but even territories close to the north, just below the Ohio River, Kentucky, Tennessee. In the by the early 1800s or so, you're going to see a growth. Already by 1800, you're seeing people move westward. And then, of course, you're going to see the Louisiana Purchase. This area is going to be great for cotton. People are going to want to move into this area. But notice something. This is going to create a greater problem. Those states in blue at the top there, and in fact, even Ohio is part of the, excuse me, now don't worry about the colors here because Ohio really should be in blue. If we're talking, another state should be in blue. I'm not sure why I have this. I probably should have used a different map. And so sorry about that. Don't worry about the colors. The point is Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that Northwest region that has been deemed off limits to slavery by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, right? That's free. Below it, we know, is open to slavery. But look at the Louisiana Purchase. It straddles that line that would be imaginary. If you take that line from the Ohio River, where where Illinois' southern point sort of meets Kentucky, right? Just to the right of where it says 1803. If you take that river line and just draw it westward, the question becomes, what happens north and south of that line? Are we going to draw that line westward? People are talking about this, and this is going to be an issue. We're going to come back to this because really, as I said, it's the spread of westward expansion that really results in this whole Civil War. So by 1800, though, because of these changes that we've seen with the boom in cotton, slavery will become more and more brutal. And freedom will become harder to win. Remember, there's no task system here with cotton. You're working can't see to can't see. You're working under close supervision. Punishments are harsher. Slave codes are harsher. And there's going to be more of a breakup of families as slaves are moving around the country. And because of all this, slave resistance will increase. They're going to be inspired slaves to rise up from the tightening restrictions, the continued violence that's heaped upon them. But at the same time, they have that revolutionary language and the idea of all men being created equal. They have that in their minds. So they're still going to draw on the American Revolution. And so they're going to draw on that spirit and on the reality of the violence that's heaped upon them on the daily. And slaves, interestingly, will also look to something else that happens in the Western Hemisphere, the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution, you should know, was really inspired in part by the American Revolution. This idea of throwing off your tyrannical masters, your enslavers, so to speak. Jefferson, remember, said the king was enslaving them. Well, in Haiti, they were real slaves. Slaves in Haiti, right around 1792, 3, something like this, they're going to rise up. They have breathed in the ideas of the American Revolution. They will overthrow their French masters, and they will establish the first black-run republic, the first black-run government in the Western Hemisphere. And by the way, it's going to be a republic. It's only the second republic in this Western Hemisphere. The first one, of course, the United States. And a republic, by the way, just means representative government, right? No king. It's not really a democracy necessarily, but it's representative. You vote for people who go to make laws. If you look at the map in the bottom left-hand corner there, you can see, of course, Haiti is part of the island of Hispaniola. We talked about this one. That's where the Arawaks were and so forth. Well, the French had, of course, colonized Haiti and created all kinds of sugar plantations there. The majority of people living there, of course, were slaves. And so they rise up, and it's a violent sort of overthrow that lasts for a very long time, by the way. It jumps off right around 1793. This Haitian Revolution is going to strike fear in white folk in the United States, really anywhere slaves are held. A lot of people fear what the Haitian Revolution might mean for them, might mean for slavery. Wherever slaves are being held, they rise up, and the Haitian Revolution is a reminder of that. So interestingly enough, the slaves in the United States, they learn of the Haitian Revolution. As I said, they're not stupid. They have their own sorts of grapevines of gossip and information, of news. They learn of the Haitian Revolution. And Black people in the United States organize. They will fight for freedom, and they believe this is well. Let me back up. The Haitian Revolution gives them this idea, not that they needed much more help, but they know that they have an actual example where Black people can organize, they can fight for freedom, and build their own government in the Western Hemisphere. So slaves in the United States are inspired to resist even more. So this is interesting, right? Because the American Revolution inspires the Haitian Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution comes back to the United States in a sense because a lot of slaves take from it inspiration to try to overthrow their own and try to form their own government and overthrow their enslavers. An example of this resistance comes in 1800 with Gabriel's Rebellion. This happens in Virginia. Gabriel is someone who organizes a revolt of about 1,000 slaves. They plan to take the capital of Virginia. They plan to kill anyone except people who are friendly to them. They plan to march under a banner that reads liberty or death. Unfortunately for these people, the plan is given up by 2 slaves before it even starts. 2 slaves. Now, when I teach this in class, you always hear somebody say, "Oh, what traitors?" or something like this. Well, look at it from their point of view. You have slaves living the lives that they do, as we've noted. And you hear that someone else is planning a slave revolt. And you know that whenever there's a slave revolt, any Black person can be killed on sight, including your children. You also know it's not likely to succeed, especially because these guys are talking about marching on the capital of Virginia. They're not talking about running into the woods and establishing a maroon community. So from the point of view of these 2 slaves, maybe they don't want this to happen because it doesn't seem like any good comes from it. So the plan never gets off the ground. The militia comes in and crushes it quickly. Before Gabriel is executed, though, he says something interesting. He says, quote, "We have as good a right to be we have as good a right to be free from your oppression as you had to be free from the tyranny of England. What's he saying? Of course, you're no different from us. You had a right, as you saw it, to overthrow the tyranny of England. We have the right to overthrow your tyranny. So the significance of Gabriel's rebellion, it's several. First of all, as I just noted, I mean, look at his words. His words are calling out the hypocrisy of this new nation. And his words are they're talking to this idea of freedom generally, not just freedom for a few. The other thing that's interesting is that, and look at the banner. The banner that they had planned to march under was was going to be written "Liberty or Death." That should sound familiar. Was it Patrick Henry who said, "Give me liberty or give me death"? And here's something else that's interesting. So the banner would, of course, draw comparisons between themselves and revolutionaries, the American revolutionaries. The other thing is, notice they were going to march on the capital of Virginia. They were not seeking to run off. Like, remember the Stono Rebellion, 1739, I think it was? The Stono Rebellion, you had slaves who were trying to escape and march off to Spanish Florida. That's not happening here. These guys are not trying to escape. They're trying to actually get revolution right where they live. To overthrow the tyranny of slavery in the nation that is forming. They're not trying to run the other way. Now, another thing that comes out of Gabriel's rebellion in terms of significance is that it's going to, there's going to be a lot of fear, of violence, and it's going to inspire, a lot of white people to want to crack down. You're going to see stricter slave codes spreading throughout Virginia, or they're going to be passed in Virginia, and you're going to see them spreading throughout the states and into the southern territories south of the Ohio River. There are going to be laws that are going to be made stricter, like the one in Virginia. And as I said, it becomes sort of this example for the rest, but you cannot teach slaves to read anymore. And the reason for that is because look at the banner. They had written down, liberty or death, death or liberty, or something like this, right? Point is, things are heating up, if you notice. The Constitutional Convention didn't handle this problem. Cotton booms. With the boom of cotton comes greater restrictions and greater demand from slaves. And that's going to cause problems as well. It's going to cause them to resist. And of course, they still have the examples of the American Revolution. They still have the example of Haiti. So by the early 1800s, these harsh restrictions on freedom and on free Black people are going to be chafing at these people. And this happens even in the North. I mean, the North is no wonderland for Black folk. We know that in the North, emancipation is gradual. In fact, many slaves live in the North until the 1840s. A good 50, 60 years after the Declaration of Independence. I mean, longer than that, right? So somebody else do the math. Here's the thing. Many slaves will live in the North into the 1840s. And of course, this is only a couple of decades before the Civil War. And the people who are freed under these laws, the gradual emancipation laws, they're going to be at a disadvantage, because it's like, okay, you're going to be freed, if you're freed at all. If I don't sell you, right, you can be freed at age 21. You're going to be well into your adult years at this time. Remember, people didn't live very, very long on the average, right? But they're going to be well into your adult years. Your best years are behind you. You may be lucky enough to have a skill that I taught you, but maybe not. And again, many others are just sold away rather than freed. In the North, by the early 1800s, abolitionist organizations, organizations that are dedicated to ending slavery, they're very few. And they're vilified, meaning made into villains, right? They're looked down upon, criticized by most white folk. But they're gaining more attention. In the early 1800s, they're calling on Congress to end slavery. And most of these are people like Quakers. All of this, of course, is going to create greater conflict, not just between North and South, but among white people of the North. Because not everybody in the North wants the end of slavery for the reasons that we talked about. What does it mean for me, basically? What does it mean for my job? What does it mean for my sister, who thinks that black guy is cute and, right now I can keep her away? But, so you get the point. They fear equality. Even white abolitionists, people who want to end slavery, they fear that they fear living next to black folk. They fear racial mixing. They fear equality. And so they also even discriminate. So even white abolitionists will discriminate against black people. They're not necessarily having tea with them, right? They don't like slavery for certain reasons, but they don't necessarily like these people as they would see them. They discriminate in housing, in employment. Black people, have mostly service jobs. It's very, very, the labor is very slave-like in a sense because they're paid very little. And all of this in the North creates a large impoverished community of black folk. Now, there's not a whole bunch of people in the North who are free black, but the black people who are there are by and large at the bottom. A few, of course, make their way and own businesses and such, and a good number of them, but they're still going to be looked down upon. In the North, even, states pass laws that limit the lives of these people. I'll just give you an example. They're called black laws, by the way, black laws, just like that. I'll give you an example. In Ohio requires, if you're going to live in Ohio, you have to have proof of being free before you can live there. If you come to Ohio as a black person, you must have proof of freedom, and you must give money, a $500 bond. That's a lot of money to live in the state, because that guarantees your, quote, good behavior. We don't trust you because of who you are, even though you're free. You must show me proof of freedom, and you must give money to the state. We put it to the side just in case you don't know how to act. Ohio even sets up a sort of border patrol. It sets it up in like 1804 to keep fugitive slaves out from the South, right? From below. Kentucky's right below it. So all of this is very complicated. Even the federal government gets involved. It passes laws to enforce the return of fugitive slaves, right? I will talk more about this later when I get to the 1850 law, but they already by 1793 are past, the early 1790s are passing laws like the return of fugitive slaves. Don't worry about that right now. I will clear that up later. The point is the federal government is getting involved in enforcing the states' rights of the South. And the federal government's actually isolating free black people. I'll give you an example. They passed the Naturalization Act in 1790, and you can read it there if you like, but basically it says this: only free white persons can become citizens. The process of naturalization, you may know, is the process by which a foreigner becomes a citizen of the United States. Here, the federal government says you have to be a white person to be a citizen, to become a citizen of the United States. In fact, black people are not considered full, even free black people are not considered citizens of the state that they live in or citizens of the United States. Free black men cannot join the military just so. Only in times of war, yeah, they'll take you, but you can't join the military otherwise. You can't be a mail carrier, for example. This, of course, means what for them? I mean, let's get back to this question. What does it mean to be an American, quote unquote? As of this time, after the revolution, are these people considered American, even if they're free? At this time, do Black Lives Matter? Amidst all of this, of course, is that you're going to see in the early 1800s a new talk about white supremacy. You're going to see scientific explanations for racial differences. We're going to talk more about this later, but what they're doing here in the early 1800s is using Enlightenment thinking. Oddly enough, Enlightenment thinking, of course, got us to the idea that maybe slavery is irrational, but Enlightenment thinking here is also going to be used sort of scientifically. The age of reason and all that kind of stuff, right? Scientific sorts of explanations for the differences in people. Why is that guy black and I'm not? Why does his hair look this way and mine looks that way? There must be a scientific biological reason for that. And in fact, maybe they're different species altogether, is what they start to say. So Enlightenment thinking, interestingly enough, it cuts both ways. On the one hand, people use it to actually try to defeat slavery, because an enlightened society shouldn't hold slaves, and others use it to try to maintain slavery. Point being, scientific explanations for racial differences are being bandied about, right? People are talking about them more and more. In fact, in the early 1800s, you see the growth of something called Bobolition. Bobolition, this is written messages, usually in cartoon form, as you can see there, or in written form like a script, where characters, black characters, are written as stereotypes. It's difficult to read what these people are saying. It's always difficult to read those, but this is an example of Bobolition, and I can't really make out what they say. Maybe I honestly have not looked as closely as I should have, perhaps. But Bobolition is where they stereotype the language of black people. They stereotype the physical traits of them. So, they make them look, big lips and very dark and simian-like, monkey-like, to be honest. They stereotype their mental abilities. They're stereotyping everything. I mean, think about this. Why is this happening now? Why are there scientific explanations for racial differences? Why is Bobolition spreading? Why now? Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that times are changing. There is a lot of resistance to this, to slavery. It's growing, right? There's also a feeling of unease among a lot of white people who see Haiti happening, and the fact that black people are trying to rule themselves. They're seeing more resistance. They're seeing people like Phyllis Wheatley writing about the revolution, writing, and better than even a lot of white people could write at this time, much better, right? They're seeing challenges to their ideas of white supremacy is really what's happening. And so because they're seeing challenges to this idea of white supremacy, they're making explanations, scientific explanations for racial differences, and they're stereotyping and lampooning and satirizing black behaviors. Along with all of this is a growing sense that races must be kept apart. And all of this is being injected into politics. I'll give you an example. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson famously has a mistress of sorts, Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was of mixed race heritage, white and black. She was his slave, but he treats her like a mistress. He takes her to France with him. He dresses her up real nice. And of course, she becomes his mistress. And because of this, a lot of people in the country, especially the opposition, Thomas Jefferson at this point, was part of the Democratic Republicans and of course the Federalists and others. Let's not go too much into that. The point is the political opposition, the people who don't like Thomas Jefferson, Adams among them, called him a mulatto president because he's having sex with a mixed race woman, that conjoining makes him black in their minds. That's what they're saying. So they fear that Thomas Jefferson has a soft heart when it comes to black folk, and therefore he, in the early Thomas Jefferson's president right around 1800, and that he, in fact, is going to promote policies of racial equality. You can see here a picture, and I took this from the Monticello site. Monticello is, of course, Jefferson's official home. It's a museum and all that kind of stuff today. But these were actual descendants of Sally Hemings. There's a whole Jefferson line that is black today, or descended from black folk. They've proven this through through DNA. What's interesting, I listened to a podcast a while back. I wish I could find it. Maybe I haven't looked hard enough, I think. But I listened to this podcast, and in the podcast, you had the descendants of Jefferson that were on the white side, and the descendants of Jefferson on the black side, those who came through Sally Hemings. And it's interesting how, they saw each other. But largely it took a while for this to be accepted, but they have been accepted. I mean, science isn't always right, but it is right here. It doesn't lie. So all this turmoil and conflict, and the reality that slavery isn't going away, that in fact black people are seen as lesser than, all this backlash will encourage some black folk to actually start thinking, maybe we can't live together in peace. In fact, many black people at this time try to, quote, go back to Africa. This is what's known as the colonization effort. Colonization. The colonization effort dates back to the 1700s. And it's when, still by 1800 or so, many slaves and freed black people were maybe recent arrivals, and they wanted to go back to Africa. And so people start talking about this. Hang on one second. I'm going to pause. I'm going to set this on mutes and check something. I will be right back. Sorry. I wish I had some music, some hold music to play for you, but I don't. Excuse me. Okay, and we're back. So as early as like 1787 or so, there are people in the country who want to go back to Africa, and these are free people who have still some ties back home, and they want help from the government to help fund it, to help secure lands in Africa, but they don't really get anywhere. So in 1815, a man named Paul Cuffey takes it upon himself. He's a very wealthy businessman. He in fact is a black man, and he's very wealthy, and he decides that maybe the best thing to do is to, in fact, take people to Africa. He's half black, half native, by the way, but he would be considered black in the society for sure. He actually is wealthy enough to own several sailing ships. He is himself a Quaker. In 1815, he actually takes several dozen freed black people from Boston, picks them up in Boston, and he chooses them. He wants them to be, quote, of good moral character, right? He's not going to take just anybody. So even here, you see people making distinctions as to who is and who is not of good moral character, right? And fair enough, not everybody's a good person. But anyway, so he takes several dozen freed black people to Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, as you can see, is there in the coast of Africa. You see the image there just above, of course, just above, of course, Liberia, which we'll talk about shortly. So he goes there, he takes them, but the British actually refuse to allow him to sell. He had actually brought cargo with him. He had intended to sell non-human cargo, because he's not a slaver. He had financed the trip himself, and he had meant to actually pay himself back. So he came out of pocket, and then he decided, I'm going to make my money back by selling all of these goods in Africa. But the British, who control this area, refused to allow him to sell the cargo he had brought with him to sell. This, of course, is going to leave a very bad taste in his mouth. Sierra Leone, it is, of course, run by the British at this time, and it's not welcoming to these people. The black community becomes discouraged by this whole thing, and they kind of back off of it, but the white community takes notice. And they're like, oh, yeah, this is a good idea. I don't want these people around either. A lot of white folk believe that the best thing for everyone, white, black, everyone, is for black people to be freed and sent back to Africa, and for all freed black people to be sent to Africa. Back to Africa is a problem, though, because by the early 1800s, you're seeing fewer and fewer people, or let's say by about 1820 or so, you're seeing fewer and fewer people coming straight from Africa. Most of these people, by the 1820s or so, are going to be the people who are enslaved are going to be people who don't have any ties to Africa. But here's the thing. White folk believe that they can rid themselves of the problem. Not just slaves, but the immorality of owning slaves. A lot of people think this is immoral, and I want to protect black people. I might not want them in my family, but they are people. It is immoral to own slaves. Therefore, we should send them away. I'm also afraid of slave rebellions. I'm also afraid of the fact that their very presence creates a problem between North and South over the issue of slavery in particular. And so in 1816, a bunch of different white people organized the American Colonization Society, where their idea is to repatriate, to send back to their home country. And again, that's problematic because a lot of these people didn't really have any ties, or they had been born here and they really don't know anything about Africa, right? So they want to send them back. They believe black people are never going to be equal in the United States. They say black people won't be equal. We could free them all here, and they will never be equal. So we should pause for just a moment and ask ourselves whether or not that's true. Have we reached full equality? For sure, we're better off than we were. Things are better, but I'll leave you to the question of whether or not we've reached full equality. We're going to talk more about this later. So they say they can't be equal, and we must protect them by sending them out, even if it's, of course they want to do it with their consent. You can't just snatch them up and take them. They also want to send the message to the South that, this is what we want to do to all your slaves. Your property and slaves is not safe. On the other hand, it could also send the message to the South that they can keep their slaves. We just want to get rid of free black people. Now, this is very complicated. let's not worry too much about it. But here's the thing. Their goals were not, here's the bottom line. Their goal wasn't necessarily because they love black people. There were many different reasons for wanting to send people to Africa. And these colonization schemes are, they're supported by the wealthy people, by presidents like Madison, Jefferson, Monroe. They are, of course, supported by abolitionists, but even racists. Racists are like, yeah, free them and send them out, or just send out all these people here from the north. In 1821, the American Colonization Society buys up land in Africa, and it begins to ship the freed people there. This land is Liberia. Liberia will be born after, sometime in the 1840s or right around 1850 or so, and it will have the capital of Monrovia, which was going to be named after who's president at the time, James Monroe. And it's still there. I have taught students from Liberia. Now you can imagine, I suppose, what the reaction of the black community might be to this. Most black people oppose it. They say, wait a minute, this is our home. We want freedom here. This is where we belong. We helped build it, either through slavery or through doing these menial jobs. And they say, we are African Americans. We straddle both cultures, both worlds, but we have very few ties to Africa. And in fact, interestingly enough, when these slaves, and by the way, there's only a few thousand that actually go there, right, to Liberia. A lot of Africans there don't want them there. They're too, quote, Americanized for them. They're you got to understand, from the white point of view, you're all kind of the same, but from the black point of view, they're not. They're different cultures. Black folk in this country are straddling both cultures, but they have few ties to Africa. And because of this colonization push, a lot of black organizations in the North begin changing their names. A lot of black organizations in the North, they might be called like the African Society of Friends or the African Manumission Society. They start dropping the word African. They're making it because they want to try to cut the tie of the image of that tie between themselves and Africa. They're making a statement. A lot of free black people in the country are afraid, right? Because they're thinking, are they going to force me out of my country? So, I mean, if we kind of take sort of just a back up kind of thing, a big picture, think about the revolutions. The revolutions had inspired all kinds of ideas about who's going to belong. And of course, that creates resistance among black people and slaves. And this resistance creates backlash among slaves and free black people. And this backlash creates more conflict and more resistance. And all of this destabilizes the nation. A lot of people, the slavery issue is heating up. A lot of people don't want slaves here because they say it destabilizes the nation. It creates divisions. And they say slavery can exist only alongside fear and brutality. And all of this, of course, is going to inspire further talk about abolitionism, further talk about ideas of equality and freedom. Meanwhile, cotton is spreading. Meanwhile, it's tying North and South together. Meanwhile, it is tying the United States to the international economy. Cotton is king by the early 1800s. Oops. And meanwhile, slavery is expanding. It's getting stronger in the South. It's moving westward, and this will be the cause of the Civil War. And of course, black people, all the while, are trying hard to be accepted by the nation. And one of the ways historically that they have done so is through military service. And it's only one way in which the Black community has sought to earn acceptance. Wars of all kinds call on people for sacrifices. Wars, any war you can think of, it calls on people to fight as soldiers and families back home and civilians to support the effort. The War of 1812 is a prime example of how this happened and how Black people stood up and took sides, most of them on the side of the United States. We're talking about the War of 1812. There's a lot of causes about, war of, let's not go into all of that. A lot of my students don't know what this is, and I wish I had time to go into it. But this is a war between the United States, of course, and England. It starts because of trade wars on the high seas between France and England, and the United States wanting to remain neutral and yada yada. Let's not worry too much about that. When war comes, though, between the United States and England, a lot of Black civilians pledge their support for the U.S. side. Black newspapers in the North and churches in the North, they heed the call. They call on their own Black community to rally to the U.S. patriot cause. They work to supply the Navy. They build fortifications to protect cities like Philadelphia. They even muster an entire Black battalion intent on fighting of free men in the North. So when the war comes, the Black community is saying, we will do our part in the North. Not everybody, for sure, but there are strong currents of this. Now, the War of 1812 is largely going to be fought on war. And because the U.S. Navy needs men, it will recruit thousands of Black men. And it promises and even gives them equal pay, interestingly enough. And it actually promises freedom to those who enlist with the permission of masters, because there are still slaves in the North, right? Well, of course, this is for everyone, right? So any North and South, if your master allows it, we will free you. Of course, in the South, this doesn't happen very much. In the North, you're more likely to see masters allowing slaves to go fight. Black men make up around 20% of the Navy crews on ships, and they become distinguished in battle. They earn praise. A guy named Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry. Perry, I'm not going to go too deeply into him. I just kind of need to throw that name out there because he was the, he's the naval leader in this whole war, and he becomes famous. Anyway, this famous guy, really, who was the head of the Navy at the time during the War of 1812, he praises Black men for, quote, what he calls bravery and good conduct. He says they are, quote, absolutely insensible to danger, meaning they ignore danger. One of his captains says they never had better fighters than these men, that they fight like devils. Interestingly, this captain still refers to them as the N-word. So the point is, the Black community is rising up, right, to support the war. Free Black people and even some slaves are going off to fight for pay and for freedom, and I suppose patriotism, right? There's a lot of reasons that people go off to fight to war. It's not always patriotism, but they do their part. Black men will also engage in one of the most famous battles of the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, which of course is New Orleans, Louisiana, where at the time, a guy named Andrew Jackson is leading a bunch of men, and he needs men, and he calls on Black folk to defend the city as fellow citizens of New Orleans, and so he calls them fellow citizens, and he promises and gives them equal pay. Now, Andrew Jackson, we know, will later on become president of the United States and all that. Jackson has these Black soldiers that fight. They fight in segregated units, but these Black soldiers join Jackson's white forces in a counterattack that finally defeats the British at the famous Battle of New Orleans. And Jackson heaps praise on these fighters. He's saying that the nation will praise them as he has done. The irony is that he's praising Black fighters, and he's one of our most vehemently racist presidents. He's a very strong believer in white supremacy. But here's an example of how the nation needs these men and the community they come from. And they're going to use them in time. They're going to use them. You know, a weird aspect of this battle is that this Battle of New Orleans was fought after the treaty was signed to end the War of 1812. The war is over. But the message of the war being over doesn't get across the Atlantic in time for everybody to know it. And the Battle of New Orleans happens after the treaty was signed, but it's still a crucial battle. If the United States had lost this battle, the British might have just backed out of that treaty, because this was a very decisive battle. If the British had won it and kept that port and everything, they might have actually backed off the treaty. So it was very important that this battle be won by the United States. So this victory at the Battle of New Orleans, that, you know, within which black men were instrumental, this victory is an exclamation point on the treaty. Now, not all black folk supported the U.S. cause in the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, Britain again promises runaways their freedom, like they did in the Revolution, right? Run away to us and we will free you. This time they say they mean it. And in fact, they do actually do a much better job of this than they did. They are intent in freeing people who run off to them, slaves. So slaves run away by the thousands. This is mostly in the Chesapeake region. They run off to the British, even though they didn't know, even though they know that, you know, this didn't quite work out well for the people who fled to the British during the American Revolution. They know that didn't work out well for everyone, for thousands, but they're still going because this is a shot. This is a chance. So they serve with the British, and this time they are more likely to fight. They become fighters in the British military against the United States. A lot of these runaway slaves, they provide intelligence. They help the British military through the rough terrain because they know the terrain. They act as messengers and spies, and of course as laborers. The point is that they're much more welcomed in the British military, or at least in the British cause, than they had been before in the Revolution. Now, their use of these slaves by the British strikes fear in the white community. They believe that the British are just trying to rile up the black folk, the native folk too, by the way, but let's not go too deeply into that. But there's constant fears among the white community of the enemy within. So even as some black people are fighting for the country, for the United States, there are some black people who are not. So from the point of view of white people, we don't know what to believe, is what they're thinking. And so this doesn't really solve anything. So as the war ends, it doesn't seem black folk are much closer to being accepted. In fact, the British use of slaves convinces many white folk that slavery must be maintained and strengthened, and that slavery is a bedrock principle of the United States. In 1814, a guy named Francis Scott Key, he writes the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. Have you ever sung the whole thing? I doubt it. Because you don't see them singing this at stadiums, right? Where in part, Key says this line, right? When he talks about, he talks about slaves, black men. He says their blood has washed out their foul footsteps, pollution, meaning because they lost, right? Because the British lose, and his thinking is, well, the slaves, of course, lost, and they lost lives as well, and they spilled blood. Their blood has washed out their foul missteps, pollution, which basically means, they got what they deserved by running away, right? To the British, they spilled their blood. And then he goes on to say, no refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. What he's saying here is that slavery is embedded. It's a bedrock principle. No refuge. He goes on to say, no refuge could save the slave from the grave, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. And so when he writes this, and again, I doubt you've sung this at your baseball or football games in completion. Yeah, when he does this, he's celebrating the defeat of the British, but he's also celebrating the place of slavery in the young nation. So, think about that, I suppose, when you think about people kneeling at baseball games or whatever, when the national anthem is played. Whatever you think about that, it's much more complicated than it seems a lot of people sort of make it out to be. The War of 1812 highlights a dilemma, right? The dilemma for Black folk is they're trying to fit in. How hard must we try to be accepted when we're not accepted? How much should we give? But what would happen if you stop trying? If they don't do this, how easy will it be to dismiss them? So they continue and they continue. But we have to remember, and this is something written by a Supreme Court justice of the mid-20th century, where he says, a people who extend civil liberties, that is freedoms, only to preferred groups start down the path either to dictatorship of the right or the left, meaning conservatives or liberals. Either way, it's a dictatorship. When you only give freedoms to certain groups of people who are preferred, that's tyranny. But that's exactly what happens at the Constitutional Convention, and of course, after the Revolution and down through the Constitutional Convention and into the early 1800s. Okay, people, I will leave this there. I know there's a lot of information here. I tried to condense it as much as possible without removing things that would tie together concepts that I think you need to understand in order to sort of grasp this entire narrative. Again, feel free to set up a time to talk to me if you have questions about this. I'm going to leave it here now, and next time, well, there's always going to be a next time until, of course, the final module. What are we going to talk about next time? I think next time we're going to talk about the lives of Black people in the South, and then, of course, in the North. Okay, I will leave you there. Thank you for your time. Be well, be good.